Gary was 53, sitting in his truck outside a Kroger in Dayton, Ohio, staring at a banking app that showed $4,200 to his name. 30 years of full-time work, and that was the entire story. What stung wasn't the balance. It was that he had done everything right, at least on paper, and still ended up here. He hadn't been lazy or reckless. He had simply followed the advice everyone gives, and it still fell short. So tell me below, how much did you expect to have saved by 50? Gary grew up watching his father count change on the kitchen table, so when he finally landed a real job at 22, he swore he'd never live like that. He got the job. He got the raises. Every few years, his paycheck grew a little fatter, and his life quietly grew right along with it. A bigger apartment, a newer truck, weekend trips he used to skip because they cost too much. None of it looked reckless from the outside. It looked like a man finally getting to enjoy what he'd earned. And that's the part you need to hear. Because if you're anywhere near 50 and wondering where your money went, there's a good chance the same thing happened to you. It's called lifestyle creep, and it doesn't feel like a mistake while it's happening. It feels like comfort. Every raise you ever got quietly turned into a slightly better car or a slightly nicer dinner out. Upgrades that never felt wrong in the moment. It works precisely because of that invisibility. It never shows up as one big decision you can point to later and regret. It shows up as dozens of small ones, spread out over 20 years, each too small to notice on its own. What makes this dangerous isn't just the money you spent, it's what that spending quietly replaced. Your income was supposed to be the thing that finally let you save more. Instead, it became the thing that let you spend more, at almost the exact same rate. Study after study on American households shows the same pattern. As pay climbs through your 30s and 40s, savings rates barely move, because the extra money gets absorbed by a slightly upgraded version of the same life. You don't notice it in any single year. You notice it in your 50s, staring at a number that doesn't match 30 years of work. Gary noticed it in that truck outside the Kroger. He wasn't buying yachts or gambling his money away in Vegas. He was living a normal, respectable life, and somehow that normal life had eaten almost everything he made. It doesn't look like failure while you're inside it. It only looks like failure once you finally step back and add it all up. If lifestyle creep were the whole story, it would already be bad enough on its own. But it's not even close to the biggest reason you might be behind. Because while your spending was quietly climbing, something else was happening with your money that you probably never noticed at all. Something built right into the very system you trusted to take care of you. Lifestyle creep alone would have been enough to knock Gary off track. But it wasn't even the main event, and if you're still watching, stick around, because the next part explains the piece almost nobody checks until it's too late. If this is hitting close to home, hit subscribe now, because the next video breaks down exactly how to catch this before it costs you another decade. Gary had a 401k. He'd had one since his late 20s, and every 2 weeks a little slice of his paycheck disappeared into it, automatically, the way it's supposed to. He figured that was the retirement plan, handled, checked off, done. Especially since he was contributing enough to get his company's match, which felt responsible. What he didn't know, what almost most nobody his age is ever told in plain language, is that enough to get the match and enough to retire are two completely different numbers, and the gap between them is where most Americans quietly fall behind. The match is usually somewhere between 3 and 6% of your pay. That number was never designed to fund a full retirement. It was designed to get you started, the way training wheels get a kid rolling down the driveway. But most people never take the training wheels off. They set their contribution once in their 20s or 30s and never touch it again. Not when they get a raise, not when the kids move out, not when the mortgage finally gets paid down and there's suddenly more room in the budget. The contribution stays frozen while the years keep moving. Then there's the part that hides even deeper in the fine print, the fees. Most retirement accounts charge management fees that sound tiny on paper, something like 1% a year. 1% sounds like nothing. But compounded over 30 years, that 1% can quietly eat a huge chunk of your total growth, sometimes well over $100,000 by the time you're ready to retire. Nobody sends you a letter explaining that. It just shows up as a slower growing balance, year after year, and you have no way to compare it to what you would have had. Because you never see the version of your life where the fee wasn't there. Gary's account had grown, that much was true, but it had grown at the speed of someone who had done the bare minimum and let the system coast, instead of someone who had actually taken the wheel. And that's the uncomfortable truth sitting underneath most men's retirement accounts at 50. Not that they didn't save at all, but that they saved on autopilot, and autopilot was never built to get you all the way there. If frozen contributions and quiet fees were the ceiling on how bad this could get, that would still be a hard pill to swallow. But there's a third piece to this, one that has nothing to do with your spending or your 401k paperwork, and it's the real reason so many men wake up at 50 feeling behind. It has to do with a decision Gary made, or rather didn't make, 20 years earlier, without ever realizing what it was costing him. 20 years before that afternoon in the truck, Gary made a decision that felt like no decision at all. He was 29. The stock market had just crashed, his coworkers were trading horror stories about their shrinking accounts, and Gary decided the smart move was to wait until things calmed down before he put any real money into investments beyond his 401k match. He told himself he'd get serious about it once he had more saved up, once the market looked safer, once life felt a little less chaotic. That day never came. Not because Gary was careless, but because there's always a reason it feels smarter to wait. A wedding to pay for, a roof that needs replacing, a market that looks shaky again. 20 years slip by inside that waiting room. There's a reason so many men do exactly what Gary did, and it isn't laziness, it's fear dressed up as caution. Watching your own money shrink, even for a little while, feels personal in a way that spending money never does, because when you spend, you got something for it, but when the market dips, it feels like the money just vanished for no reason at all. So a lot of men quietly decide it's safer to keep their money somewhere it can't drop, without realizing that a savings account earning less than inflation is losing value every single year, just slower and quieter than a bad stock market day. It doesn't feel like losing money, it just feels like nothing is happening. But nothing happening is its own kind of loss, stretched out over decades instead of concentrated into one bad headline. Here's what that wait actually cost him. Money that goes into the market early doesn't just sit there, it grows. And then the growth itself starts growing, year after year, quietly snowballing in a way that feels like nothing until suddenly it's everything. Financial people call this compound interest, but you don't need the term to understand the idea. Picture a snowball rolling down a long hill. In the first few seconds, it barely changes size. Give it enough hill, though, and it turns into something that can flatten a house. The hill is time. And the cruel part is, the first 10 years on that hill matter more than the last 20 combined. Because that's when the snowball is picking up the size it needs to grow fast later. If Gary had put just $300 a month into a simple low-cost index fund starting at 29 instead of waiting by the time he hit 53, that money could have grown into well over $250,000, even with completely average market returns. Not because he was smart with stock picks, not because he timed anything perfectly, just because he let time do what time does, instead of asking it to wait for permission. That $250,000 isn't sitting in some parallel version of Gary's life. It simply never existed because the 20 years it needed to grow got spent waiting for a better moment that never arrived. And that's really the whole story. It was never about how much money you made. It was always about how long you let your money have to grow. Gary made good money for 30 years. He just never gave enough of it the one thing it actually needed, which was time. And time is the one thing you cannot buy back once you turn 50. But here's what you need to hold on to, because this is not a story about being doomed. 50 is not too old to fix this. It feels that way, sitting in a truck outside a grocery store doing math in your head. But the math is more forgiving than it feels in that moment. The government actually builds an extra room for people your age. It's called a catch-up contribution, and once you turn 50, you're allowed to put significantly more into your 401k and your IRA every single year than someone younger is allowed to put in. Specifically because lawmakers know this exact gap exists for millions of people. Most men never even know this option exists, let alone use it. Beyond that, the fix isn't complicated, even if it isn't easy. It starts with finding out exactly what you're contributing right now, today, and raising it, even by a small amount, because a small increase held for 15 years does far more than a big increase you only manage for 2. It means moving any spare money out of a savings account earning almost nothing and into a simple, low-cost index fund, the same tool that would have grown Gary's $250,000, because at 50, you still likely have 15, 20, even 30 years for money to grow, before you'll need to touch most of it. And it means being honest about the lifestyle creep from earlier, not cutting everything you enjoy, but redirecting even a portion of every future raised straight into that account before your daily life quietly absorbs it the way it always has. None of this erases the 20 years Gary spent waiting, but it means the next 20 don't have to look the same way. Gary didn't fix his entire financial life in one night sitting in that truck. Nobody manages that in one night. What he did was smaller than that, and honestly more useful. He went home, pulled up his 401k account for the first time in years, and increased his contribution by 4%. Not because 4% felt dramatic, But because it was the number that still let him pay his bills without feeling squeezed, and momentum matters more than perfection when you're starting from behind. That's the part most financial advice skips over. It talks about maximizing everything, optimizing everything, squeezing every last dollar into the perfect account, and for a man staring at $4,200 at 53, that kind of advice feels less like help and more like a reminder of how far behind he already is. The truth is simpler and kinder than that. You don't need the perfect plan. You need a plan that's slightly better than what you were doing yesterday, held for long enough that time can actually work on it. 6 months later, Gary checked his account again. It hadn't transformed because nothing transforms in 6 months, but it had grown a little faster than it used to, and for the first time in years, he understood exactly why. The extra contribution, the lower fees after switching to a cheaper fund, the small decisions that were already starting to add up. That understanding mattered more than the dollar amount. He wasn't guessing anymore, he was steering. Really, the whole story comes down to one idea. Being broke at 50 was never a life sentence. It was a signal, the same way a low fuel light is a signal, not a verdict on the whole trip. It tells you something needs attention right now, not that the trip is already over. Gary's number at 53 wasn't the end of his story. It was the moment he finally started reading the dashboard instead of ignoring it. And there's something else worth saying plainly, because it rarely gets said out loud. Being behind at 50 doesn't just threaten your own retirement, it shapes what your kids learn about money without you ever teaching them a single lesson on purpose. Gary's own son watched him make that call to increase his contribution, watched him actually open the account instead of avoiding it, and asked him about it later that week. That's how the pattern breaks, not with a speech, with a decision someone else happens to witness. Control is the word Gary used months later when someone asked him what changed. Not richer, not yet. Just in control, for the first time since he was 22 years old. And it turned out that feeling was worth more to him, at least at first, than the number sitting in the account. A year after that afternoon in the truck, Gary sat down and ran the numbers again, the same way he had that day outside the Kroger. The account was still nowhere near where he wanted it. But for the first time, the number was climbing on purpose instead of drifting by accident, and that difference changed how he felt every time he opened the app, even before the balance caught up to match it. Nobody threw him a parade for increasing a 401k contribution by 4%. Nobody was ever going to. But quietly reclaiming a decision he'd been avoiding for 20 years did more for how Gary slept at night than any parade could have. You now know the 3 things that quietly kept Gary, and probably you, stuck at 50. The slow creep of a lifestyle that grows exactly as fast as your paycheck, a retirement account running on autopilot instead of intention, and 20 years spent waiting for a moment that never had to come. Knowing those 3 things is real progress. But knowing what went wrong isn't the same as knowing exactly how much you need saved by the time you actually retire, or whether the number you're picturing right now is anywhere close to enough. The next video answers exactly that question, step by step with real numbers for real ages. Because knowing you're behind is only useful once you know exactly how far and exactly what closes the gap. Watch that video next and find out precisely where you stand. Because the version of you at 60 is still being decided by what you do this week.